Today is the 22nd of April in the year of our Lord 2020. For American Literature Week 30, we're continuing to read Peace Like a River. This week we're going to read pages 167 through 238. And let's talk about that. Let's keep going. Next slide. Here are the analysis issues that I'd like you to look at. First of all, notice that I'm asking you to write 2 talking points to the following. Remember, a talking point consists of a thesis and 2 to 3 sentences that argue or support your thesis. I'm not asking for a declamation or anything like that. The first issue is whether it is consistent with God's character to keep the police from seeing the lands. We'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about all 7 of these. This is worded slightly different than the assignment sheet that was issued on Monday. So please notice that I corrected it. Number 2, whether Swede should have sabotaged Mr. Andreessen's car, whether it was a miracle that they met Roxana, whether there's such a thing as what Jeremiah Land calls spookism. This is definitely reworded from what I originally sent out on Monday. Whether Reuben should have told his father about meeting Davy, whether Jabe Waltzer should have helped Davy, and whether Jabe Waltzer is a good man. Let's move on now. So the issue is whether it is consistent with God's character for the police to keep the police from seeing the lands. Beginning in this chapter on page, what is this? Page 167, they knew that the police were after them. Mr. Andreessen had, well, it says, "It is true. The police were after us. I believe Dad knew it in his gut when he saw the first of them. Swede knew it too. Tell you how in a minute. Later, the putrid Fed, that's Mr. Andreessen himself, would confirm the fact. He twisted the arm of the weak-willed chief of the North Dakota State Patrol, a man named Muriel, whose picture I've seen since, and with that name, the little dimpled chin, what chance did he ever have? And Muriel had ordered a disproportionate measure of his force to Mandan, that's in North Dakota, plus a few more spots along the route Andreessen had guessed correctly we would choose. So Mr. Andreessen wants to catch these guys. They want to catch the lands while they're still in North Dakota. So he twists the arm of the state patrolman, Mr. Muriel, Officer Muriel, and Muriel sends a bunch of his men to go look for them. An easy assignment, wouldn't you think? Stopping a family in a green Plymouth wagon, pulling a 20-foot Airstream trailer. There might be more Airstream trailers in North Dakota during the summer, but remember, this is in January. So there probably wouldn't be that many. And then Reuben goes on to say they didn't get us, though. Not one of them even saw us, though we saw them as I've described. We tiptoed through that town like a fat boy through a wolf pack. Make of it what you will, it gives me satisfaction yet, thinking of that evening, how each trooper must have dutifully reported to Muriel of the State Patrol that the day had passed without event. It pleased me to think of poor soft Muriel then garnering up courage and laying hold of the phone and dialing Martin Andreessen to inform him he'd misguessed. Swede then goes on to talk to Reuben about their father. Swede thinks that this is somehow her father's powers, that he's like a prophet. He's like Moses, she says, going through the Red Sea. And there's a long discussion about that in the next part of the book. But here, the question is this a miracle? Well, it's an unusual event. The question, though, is whether this is in keeping with God's character. Didn't God, in Romans 13:1-2, say that the civil authority are his ministers? Isn't it true that we as Christians should obey these ministers? If the father knew the police were looking for him, didn't he have an obligation as a Christian to turn himself in, him and his family? Isn't that what obedience to the civil authorities would require? Well, that's the question you need to answer. When do we obey the civil authorities? When do we not obey the civil authorities? Are there ever chances or times when we should obey the civil authorities? You need to answer that question. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, on this slide, we're talking about whether Swede should have sabotaged Mr. Andreessen's car. One thing bothered me, though, that Andreessen had gone to such exertions. Hadn't he come to talk right in our own trailer just the previous night? And hadn't he gone away with nothing worse than us from passive defiance? What had caused the putrid Fred for hounding us? I was actually expecting it, Sweet said. Well, bully for you. Sure, I was a little sour. You know Andreessen is still looking for us. Now I guess somebody else is too. Andreessen's back in Linton. He wouldn't still be in Linton, you know. He'd be someplace else. He'd have had a hard time getting out of Linton. Sweet looked up, itching to tell me something now. A thing she'd been saving. So Sweet here has a secret. And Reuben doesn't know what it is. Come on, then, say it while your mouth is open. I crept over there, she declared, and spoiled his car. It was an act of sabotage. Don't tell Dad. All right, so what did Sweet do to this federal officer's car? This was so far outside what I expected, it rendered me perfectly stupid. In other words, speechless. Maple syrup down his gas tank, she explained. Oh, how scared and proud she looked. Then the strangest of that morning came clear. No wonder she'd been so agitated, trying to get us out of town. No wonder she'd rousted us out of bed. So what happened is, while they were talking to Mr. Andreessen, Sweet got it in her mind to take the maple syrup, go over to his car, and this is in the days before gas tanks were locked in the car and you couldn't get to them. They were just something that popped open. And she took that bottle of syrup and poured it down into his gas tank. Now, would that ruin a car? Yes, it would. Not just make it stop running, it would ruin it. So, and back in and especially today, back then maybe you could fix it, but it'd be very difficult. And no matter what, the car is not going to be running. So she sabotaged this. Now, that car either was Mr. Andreessen's personal property or it was federal property. What this young lady has done, if it was federal property, is committed a federal crime. She has destroyed federal property. Should she have done that? Was that an appropriate thing to do? Now, why did she do it? Was it an act of malice? Or was it an act of trying to protect her brother? Was this an act of loyalty? Where does family loyalty end? And where does obedience to the governing authorities begin? Was Swede wrong to do this? Now you could say she's a child. She's not an adult. She can't be held responsible for it. Her father didn't tell her to do it. She snuck out without his knowing it. But she did it. Was that wrong? All right, let's move on to the next question. All right, whether it was a miracle that they met Roxana. So here we have Roxana. No one answered is not. What happened is they thought they were running out of gas, but miraculously the car keeps running, even though it should have run out of gas a long time ago. They pull into this gas station. Sunday morning. Most people are closed. Back in those days, most people closed on Sundays. It was nice back in those days. I remember that very clearly. There were very few places open on Sunday. So they knock on the door. Mrs. No one answered his knock, though we could hear voices inside. He knocked again, and this time the voices got louder, and the door opened, and a woman was standing there with a baby goat in her arms, just a little goat, sucking at a bottle she held. She looked surprised at the three of us. It's Sunday, she said. We're shut. Is Dale here? Dad inquired. Sir, the woman informed him, Dale has not been here since November. It's hard to look back and describe Roxana to you as she was when we first saw her. Big-boned, yes, but not the cushiony sense people often mean. Tall, dirt-road blonde hair, and a black swung braid, wind-burned in the face. She looked like some woman from a polar dog sled exposition recounted in the Geographic. She looked, I would say, built to last. My sympathies, Dad said. Appreciated, but gratuitous, the woman replied, and Swede would have loved her forever for that phrase alone. Dale left November 25th, and every day since has been Thanksgiving. Well, what does a person say to that? I watched Dad look down at his feet, smiling, one hand rubbing the back of his neck. The woman stood there holding her goat, which was yanking single-mindedly at the bottle. Let it go once to bleed, and bumped her chest with a blunt nose. Dad looked up. Ma'am, I sure hope you'll sell us some gas. I know you'd rather not to on Sunday. At this moment, better observer than me would have seen some acquiescence in the woman's eyes, some raising of the gate. I saw nothing of the kind, but Dad must have, for when she abruptly shut the door, he stayed right there. Sweet started to talk, but he hushed her. The wind snapped our coats around our legs, and now carried a few gnats of ice. From far inside the house we heard a goat's voice. Then the door opened again, and the woman came out in a parka with a fur up around her ears and walked fast ahead of us to the pump. So she agrees to give them gasoline even though it's Sunday and Dale's gone. Is this a miracle? Now, if you recall the first part of the book, Reuben talks about miracles. He says many people look at miracles like newborn baby chicks or a sunrise, and they say that's a miracle. But he says those aren't miracles. He says, let me go back to page 3. He says, let me say something about that word miracle. For too long it's been used to characterize things or events that, though pleasant, are entirely normal. Peeping chicks at Easter time, spring generally, a clear sunrise after an overcast week, a miracle, people say, as if they've been educated from greeting cards. I'm sorry, but nope. Such things are worth our notice every day of the week, but to call them miracles evaporates the strength of the word. So I don't know if Reuben would have said this is a miracle if it rises to that, but it was something. It wasn't. This was providential. Here is this woman alone, and she has gasoline. They need gas. She's willing to sell it to him. Something going on here. Is it a miracle or is it something else? Is it a coincidence? Is it just a random event? Are there such things as random events? As Christians, can we believe in random events? Is it just luck? That's something you need to answer. All right, let's move on to the next question. All right, the question is whether Mr. Andreessen should have asked Jeremiah Land to use spookism to find the Davy. That is the original question. But I've reworded the question to say, does spookism exist? What is spookism? All right, so Mr. Andreessen tells this story. He says, 2 years ago there was a kidnapping, a little girl in Michigan. The kidnapper put her in a rented cabin and drove away to find a phone booth. Only he went off on an icy curve and smacked a barn, and that was it for him. Want to guess how he found the little girl? Just finished, Mr. Andreessen. I don't blame you. Actually, I thought my supervisor was off his nut. He'd been talking to the family and their friends. There was a sister, about 11. He came to me. This is Ray Levy, my supervisor. He thought the sister could help locate the little girl. You don't know what you're associating with, Dad said. Well, that's the truth, and I don't pretend to. But the sister went out with us. We drove in a rough circle, starting from their home. Listen, it's not exactly procedure, and it doesn't make any popular sort of sense. To his credit, Mr. Andreessen appeared less than cozy with the story he was telling. He lit another cigarette and looked at it while he talked. At some point, she began telling us where to turn. It upset her. She cried, and so forth. We made some wrong turns. I'll not lie to you. We all knew the ending, though, same as you do. We found her just before dark, he said. The cabin was freezing. She wouldn't have made it till morning. The whole thing made my insides sick. Don't get me wrong. I was glad the little girl was all right. Yet it gave me a seasick clutch behind the ribs, as if my heart were bobbing loose. I wanted to bolt from there, for I'd found I didn't hate Mr. Andreessen anymore. I feared him, not knowing why, and can testify you that this was worse. I can't do what you're asking, Mr. Andreessen, Dad said. You're a man of faith. Everyone says it. It isn't faith you're speaking of. It's something else, foolishness or spookism. All right, so what Mr. Andreessen wants Davy's dad, Jeremiah Land, to travel around with him in the car and kind of feel out where Davy might be. This is what he calls spookism. Now, Mr. Andreessen introduces this topic with this story about this 11-year-old sister who locates this girl mostly by fear and whatever sixth sense you might want to call that she was doing. Is this true? Does this exist? Or is it like like Jeremiah says, when he says, you don't know what you're associating with? Is he implying, what is he implying? That this is some kind of demonic activity? Is that what he's talking about? Is it extrasensory perception? Is it just kindred spirits? I don't know what it is. But is there such a thing as spookism? That's what you need to answer in this question if you select this one. All right, let's move on. Ooh, this is a little blurry. Sorry about that. All right, the question is whether Reuben should have told his father about meeting Davy. So we get to this point, and Reuben's outside doing something, collecting eggs or I forget what, and he sees Davy, and Davy picks him up, and they have a conversation. All right, so he says, let me see. It seemed to me that Davy ought to have known. What he said was, somebody saw you. He said you took a pig out of somebody's barn, a couple of pigs. Oh, Davy said, oh, like a gentleman who never suggested that Andreessen had simply followed us out there, that had we not set out from roofing, he'd have had no call to suspect the Badlands. Word of 2 stolen pigs might have reached the local sheriff, but hardly farther. We sat a moment and said, I can't come down, that's all. The truth is, Rube, I'm trying real hard to miss the penitentiary. I couldn't blame him. I still don't. But it put me in a hard spot. What am I supposed to say to them when I get back? Nothing. He looked at me so alarmed I recognized my idiocy. Don't tell Dad, and especially don't tell Swede. Goodness sakes, Reuben. Okay. But I couldn't imagine going back and not telling Swede, at least. He wasn't even sure it was possible. Rube, Davy said, honestly, I can't talk to Dad right now. And so Davy asked Reuben not to tell his father, not to tell Swede. Was Reuben obligated to say yes? Was Reuben obligated to obey this? Should he have told his father? Mr. Andreessen is making a point. They're hunting Davy. They're getting close. When they hunt him, he's a wanted man. They're going to go in armed. It's very possible that Davy would be killed in any kind of encounter. Nobody knows. They consider him dangerous, if not armed. So, to get him where they could catch him without having any kind of dangerous situation where Davy might get hurt or killed, that might be the better solution. But Davy insists that Reuben not tell his father, and Reuben agrees. Should he have? Where does family loyalty end, and obedience and wisdom and obeying the civil authorities begin? Where do we go with these kind of questions? All right, let's go to the next question. All right. Whether Jape Walzer should have helped Davy. All right. So this is Jape Walzer telling Reuben how he met Davy. Jape Walzer had gone to a local place, a diner, ordered steak and eggs, and he noticed that the police were looking for somebody, and that somebody was probably driving that Studebaker. And then he saw Davy acting kind of strange, so he just sat there and watched. Davy had gone up and paid his bill, and how he'd stopped beside Walzer's table to observe the street. Then he returned to the counter and inquired of Williams the whereabouts of the restroom. So Davy understands that he's being pursued. He can't get to the car because the police are watching it. Williams pointed to the rear of the cafe. Seeing this, Walzer laid money beside his plate, left by the front door. He walked past the Studebaker, nodded to the deputy, rounded the corner, and entered the alley where behind the cafe Davy stood hunched in calculation. So what had happened was David crawled out the window. Talk ensued, during which Walzer was stirred by the boy's assurance under stress. Walzer believed in invented destiny, and invented some then and there. A quarter of an hour later, the pair of them were riding an overlaid fry into the hills above Amadon. It was too bad about the Studebaker, but a recently burst gasket had it leaking oil all over the place. Perhaps it was for the best. So what happened was Jape Walzer had detected that Davy was a wanted man. When he knew that Davy was going to go to the restroom, he realized that Davy was going to try and sneak out the back way, which is through the restroom window or some door or something like that. And sure enough, he found Davy, didn't know what to do. So Jape Walzer helps him, puts him on the back of his horse, and they all leave together, and leave the Studebaker and the police wondering what happened. Should Jape Walzer have helped Davy? Should Jape Walzer have committed to helping an escaped felon? That he was convicted. It wasn't like he wasn't convicted, but he was a wanted man. And Jape Walzer knew that. I don't think Davy lied to him. Davy told him what was going on. So Jape Walzer helped him. Was that the right thing to do? Was it the wrong thing to do? Should Jape Walzer have gone over and told the police, hey, this man, the man you're looking for is in the alley. He's right over there. But he doesn't. He helps him. Was that right? Was that wrong? Would you have accepted help from Jape Walzer? Is Jape Walzer the kind of man that you want to help? Which leads us to the last question, which is whether Jape Walzer is a good man. On the page prior to this, on page 231, Jape Walzer was talking about what he saw when he met Davy. He had said, Most pleasing to me was that no matter the deputy's charge that day, he was surely waiting for the wrong person. Do you understand that, Reuben? No, sir. He should have been after the bearded fellow he could see through the front window eating steak and eggs. Another about himself, Walter said gleefully. But he looked straight past me, you see. He was quite blind. Inside of a wolf, he was hunting squirrel. So he considers himself a wolf. Davy just a little squirrel. Is that the kind of man he is? Is he a good man? He helped Davy. Is he a good man? That's the question, the last question you have. All right. Hope that helps in your reading. I hope you're enjoying this book. Pretty soon, next week, we'll talk about final exams. All right, thank you. Have a good day.